The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the weathered planks of the shack, as Delilah Kane balanced precariously on a rickety wooden chair, attempting to hang faded blue curtains across the single grimy window that overlooked an endless expanse of Kansas prairie. The fabric had cost her nearly everything she had left after selling her mother's wedding ring in Hays City, but even these threadbare curtains represented something she desperately needed: a sense of home, however false it might be. The chair wobbled beneath her feet, and she gripped the rough wooden frame of the window tighter, her calloused hands testimony to the hard months since her father's death had left her alone in this unforgiving territory. The sound of hooves approaching made her freeze mid-motion, one hand clutching the curtain rod while the other pressed against the wall for balance. Visitors were rare out here, 5 miles from the nearest neighboring property, and in her experience, rare visits in Kansas in 1875 rarely meant good news. Through the dusty window, she could make out a tall figure on horseback, sitting straight in the saddle with the easy confidence of a man who owned the ground he rode upon. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stepped down from the chair, smoothing her worn calico dress and tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. The knock came firm and steady, not aggressive but certainly not tentative either. Delilah wiped her dusty hands on her apron and opened the door just wide enough to see out, keeping her father's old rifle within easy reach against the wall. The man who stood before her was probably in his early 30s, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of Kansas sky just before a storm. He removed his hat immediately, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his well-made shirt. Everything about him spoke of prosperity, from his quality boots to the strong horse that waited patiently behind him. "Miss," he said, his voice deep and surprisingly gentle. "I am Frank Keller. I own the ranch about 3 miles northeast of here. I wanted to introduce myself properly, seeing as we are neighbors of sorts." Delilah opened the door a fraction wider, studying him carefully. She had heard of Keller, of course. Everyone in Ellis County knew of the Keller Ranch, one of the most successful cattle operations between Hays City and the Colorado border. What she could not fathom was why a man of his standing would ride out to this miserable shack just to introduce himself to someone like her. "Delilah Kane," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I appreciate the courtesy, Mr. Keller, but as you can see, I am rather occupied at the moment." His gaze moved past her into the dim interior of the shack, taking in the bare walls, the simple cot in the corner, the makeshift table fashioned from old crates, and the curtains she had been attempting to hang. Something in his expression softened, though she could not quite name the emotion she saw there. It was not pity, which she would have resented immediately, but something closer to understanding mixed with a determination she did not yet comprehend. "Miss Kane, I will be direct with you because I suspect you are not a woman who appreciates false pleasantries," Frank said, turning those storm-colored eyes back to her face. "This property you are living on technically falls within the boundaries of my ranch. The previous owner, a prospector named Henderson, abandoned it 3 years ago when his claim came up dry. I have been paying the taxes on this land since then, which makes it legally mine." Delilah felt her stomach drop. She had feared something like this, but the land office in Hays City had assured her the property was available for homesteading. Clearly, she had been misled, whether through malice or simple incompetence. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the door, her mind already racing through her limited options. She had nowhere else to go, no family left, and barely enough money to survive another month, let alone secure new lodging. "I see," she said quietly, lifting her chin even as her world threatened to crumble around her. How long do I have to vacate the premises? Frank replaced his hat, but he did not turn to leave. Instead, he looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. That depends entirely on you, Miss Kane. You see, I did not ride out here to evict you. I rode out here to offer you a position. A position, Delilah repeated, suspicion creeping into her tone. She had heard enough stories about what kind of positions wealthy ranchers sometimes offered to desperate young women, and she would rather starve than compromise herself that way. Frank must have read the wariness in her eyes because he held up both hands in a placating gesture. I need a housekeeper and cook at my ranch. The previous woman who held the position married one of my ranch hands last month and moved to their own homestead. I have been making do with burned beans and dust for the better part of 3 weeks now, and my men are threatening mutiny. The position comes with a private room in the main house, fair wages, and respectable employment. Delilah studied him carefully, searching for any hint of deception or ulterior motive. His expression remained open and earnest, and despite her instinct to trust no one in this harsh land, something about Frank Keller made her want to believe him. Perhaps it was the genuine frustration in his voice when he mentioned burned beans, or the way he kept a respectful distance, never once attempting to intimidate her with his physical presence or social standing. "Why me?" she asked finally. "You could hire anyone from Hayes City. Why ride all the way out here to offer the position to someone you have never met?" "Because anyone I hire from Hayes City would come with family ties, social obligations, and expectations that extend beyond simple employment," Frank replied honestly. "You, Miss Kane, are new to this area. You need work, and I need someone capable and honest. When I was in the land office yesterday settling some paperwork, I overheard the clerk mention you had inquired about this property. I made some discreet inquiries and learned you recently lost your father and came west looking for a fresh start. That tells me you are not afraid of hard work or hard circumstances." The mention of her father sent a pang through Delilah's chest, but she refused to show weakness in front of this stranger, no matter how kind his offer seemed. She thought of the curtain still hanging askew on the window behind her, of the nights she had lain awake listening to the wind howl through the gaps in the walls, of the loneliness that threatened to suffocate her in this isolated place. Working in a proper house, with steady wages and a roof that did not leak, sounded like a dream she had given up on weeks ago. "I would need to see the accommodations before I agree to anything," Delilah said carefully. "And I would want the terms of employment clearly established from the beginning. I am a hard worker, Mr. Keller, but I will not tolerate any impropriety." "I would expect nothing less," Frank said, and this time there was the hint of a smile at the corners of his mouth. "I can take you there now if you are amenable. You can inspect the premises, meet some of my ranch hands, and decide for yourself whether the position suits you. If you choose not to accept, I will have one of my men help you transport your belongings wherever you wish to go, and we will consider the matter closed." Delilah glanced back at the shack, at the curtains that represented her futile attempt to transform this hovel into something resembling a home. The whole situation felt surreal, as if the universe had decided to answer a prayer she had been too proud to voice. Still, years of hardship had taught her caution, and she would not leap blindly into any arrangement without seeing it through clear eyes first. "Give me a moment to gather a few things," she said, making her decision. "I will accompany you to see the ranch, but I am making no promises yet." "Fair enough," Frank agreed, stepping back to give her space to close the door. Inside the shack, Delilah moved quickly, her heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and something that might have been hope. She grabbed her mother's shawl, the only truly fine thing she still possessed, and wrapped it around her shoulders despite the heat. After a moment's hesitation, she also took her father's rifle, propping it carefully by the door before stepping outside to face Frank again. He nodded at the rifle without comment, then gestured toward his horse. "She can carry both of us for 3 miles without difficulty. Unless you would prefer I send someone back with a wagon." "This will suffice," Delilah said, though her stomach fluttered nervously at the prospect of riding so close to him. She had not been in such proximity to any man since her father's death, and the intimacy of sharing a horse suddenly felt overwhelming. Frank mounted first, then extended his hand down to her. His palm was warm and calloused when she took it, his grip strong but careful as he helped her swing up behind him. Delilah settled onto the horse's back, acutely aware of how close she sat to Frank's broad shoulders. She hesitated for only a moment before placing her hands lightly on his waist, holding on just firmly enough to maintain her balance as the horse began to move. They rode in silence for a while, the Kansas prairie stretching out endlessly around them. The land here was beautiful in its stark way, all golden grass and endless sky, with the occasional stand of cottonwoods marking the path of a creek bed. Delilah found herself relaxing slightly as they traveled, lulled by the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the solid warmth of Frank's presence in front of her. "Tell me about your father," Frank said after a while, his voice carrying easily over the wind. "If that is not too painful a subject." Delilah considered refusing, but something about the genuine interest in his tone made her want to share. Perhaps it was simply the relief of having someone to talk to after weeks of isolation. Or perhaps it was the strange sense of trust this man inspired despite their brief acquaintance. "He was a carpenter back in Missouri," she said softly. "A good one, known for his fine work on furniture and home finishing. But after my mother died, something in him broke. He started drinking, lost his shop, lost everything we had built. When he finally got sober, he was convinced we needed a fresh start somewhere far away from all the memories and mistakes. So we came west." "How did he die?" Frank asked gently. "Pneumonia," Delilah replied, the words still heavy with grief even months later. "We made it as far as Hays City before he fell ill. The doctor tried, but Father's lungs had never been strong, and the journey had weakened him. He lasted 2 weeks before the fever took him. I used the last of our money to bury him properly, then tried to figure out what to do next. That shack seemed like the only option I could afford." Frank was quiet for a moment, and Delilah wondered if she had shared too much, revealed too many vulnerabilities to this stranger who held so much power over her immediate future. But when he spoke again, his voice held only warmth and a hint of admiration. "You are braver than most men I know, Miss Kane. Coming west is hard enough with family and resources. Doing it alone after such loss requires a strength many people never possess." The compliment settled over her like a warm blanket, unexpected and deeply appreciated. "I had no choice," she said simply. "Giving up was not an option." "There is always a choice," Frank countered. "You could have married the first man who offered, which I suspect happened more than once in Hays City. A woman of your obvious qualities would not lack for proposals, however unsuitable they might be." Delilah felt her cheeks warm at the indirect compliment. "I will not marry out of desperation," she said firmly. "My mother married my father for love, and even though they did not have an easy life, she never regretted her choice. I will not settle for less than what they had, even if that means I never marry at all." "A romantic," Frank observed, and there was approval in his tone rather than mockery. "Good. Too many people out here forget that life should be about more than just survival." They crested a low rise, and Delilah caught her first glimpse of the Keller ranch spread out before them in the valley below. Her breath caught in her throat at the sight. The main house was a sprawling two-story structure built of solid timber and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and side. Several outbuildings dotted the property, including a large barn, a bunkhouse, and what appeared to be a chicken coop and smokehouse. Cattle grazed in the near pasture, sleek and healthy, while horses occupied a large corral closer to the barn. Everything spoke of prosperity and careful management, a stark contrast to the failing homesteads and struggling ranches she had seen elsewhere in Kansas. "It is beautiful," Delilah breathed, unable to keep the awe from her voice. "It is home," Frank said simply, but she could hear the pride underlying his words. "My father started this ranch 30 years ago with nothing but a land grant and determination. He built it into something worth having, and when he died 5 years ago, I inherited both the ranch and the responsibility to keep it thriving." As they drew closer, several men emerged from the barn, pausing in their work to watch the approaching horse with undisguised curiosity. Frank raised a hand in greeting, and they responded in kind, though their eyes remained fixed on Delilah with the frank appraisal of men unused to seeing women on the property. Frank dismounted first, then helped Delilah down with the same careful courtesy he had shown earlier. Her legs felt unsteady after the ride, and she was grateful for his steadying hand on her elbow until she found her balance. One of the ranch hands, a grizzled man with gray streaking his dark beard, approached with a knowing smile. "So you finally found someone willing to take on the challenge of keeping this place running, boss," the man said, his tone friendly and teasing. "I was starting to think you would work poor Miguel to death trying to cook and ranch at the same time." "Miss Delilah Kane, this is Charlie Wright, my foreman and the closest thing I have to a conscience around here," Frank said, making the introduction with easy familiarity. "Charlie, Miss Kane is considering the housekeeper position. I trust you and the men will be on your best behavior to make a good impression." Charlie swept off his hat with exaggerated gallantry, revealing hair that was more gray than dark upon closer inspection. "Miss Kane, it is an absolute pleasure. I promise you, we are all civilized enough not to eat with our hands more than 3 days a week, and most of us have been known to wash behind our ears at least monthly." Despite her nervousness, Delilah found herself smiling at the older man's humor. There was something inherently likable about Charlie Wright, a warmth and genuineness that put her somewhat at ease. The other ranch hands had returned to their work, though she caught several curious glances in her direction as Frank led her toward the main house. The front porch was even more impressive up close, with sturdy railings and chairs positioned to take advantage of the evening breeze. Frank opened the door and gestured for Delilah to enter ahead of him, and she stepped into the coolness of the house with frank curiosity. The interior matched the exterior's promise. A large central room served as a combination parlor and dining area, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall and a long wooden table that could easily seat a dozen people. Doorways led off to what she assumed were additional rooms, and a staircase against the far wall led to the second floor. Everything was well made and sturdy, but everywhere she looked, Delilah could see the evidence of a house running without a woman's touch. Dust coated most surfaces, dishes were piled haphazardly on the table, and a general air of disorder pervaded the space. It was not filthy exactly, but it had the neglected feeling of a place where function had completely overtaken form. "The kitchen is through here," Frank said, leading her through another doorway into a large room that made her carpenter's heart sing with appreciation. A massive cast iron stove dominated one wall, with ample counter space and cabinets surrounding it. A hand pump over a deep sink promised running water, a luxury she had not expected. Windows on 2 walls let in abundant light, and a door on the far side led to what appeared to be a well-stocked pantry. "This is magnificent," Delilah said honestly, running her hand along the smooth wooden countertop. "Whoever designed this kitchen knew what they were doing." "My mother," Frank said, and there was both love and sadness in his voice. "She died when I was 15, but she had very specific ideas about how her kitchen should be laid out. Father built it exactly to her specifications, down to the placement of every cabinet and the height of the counters." Delilah looked at him with new understanding. This house, for all its current disarray, had been built with love and care. She could feel it in the solid construction, see it in the thoughtful details that made a house a home rather than just a shelter. The idea of bringing order and beauty back to such a place suddenly felt less like employment and more like a calling. "Let me show you the room that would be yours," Frank continued, leading her back through the main room and up the stairs. The second floor held several bedrooms, and he indicated the one at the far end of the hallway. "This was my sister's room before she married and moved to Denver with her husband. It has been empty for 2 years now, but it is yours if you want it." Delilah stepped into the room and felt something in her chest tighten with emotion. It was easily 3 times the size of the entire shack she had been living in, with a real bed covered in quilts, a wardrobe for clothes, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and windows that overlooked the prairie in 2 directions. Curtains, real proper curtains in a soft cream color, hung on those windows, and the late afternoon sun filtered through them to bathe the room in golden light. She thought of the threadbare blue curtains she had been hanging in the shack, of her futile attempt to make something beautiful out of nothing, and suddenly the contrast was almost too much to bear. She turned away from Frank quickly, not wanting him to see the tears that threatened to spill down her cheeks. "Miss Kane." His voice was concerned, and she heard him take a step closer. "If the room does not suit, there are others. I did not mean to presume." "No," Delilah managed, her voice thick with emotion. "The room is perfect. It is just that when you arrived today, I was hanging curtains in that shack, trying to convince myself I could make it into something livable. And now here I am, standing in a real room with real curtains, and it feels like I must be dreaming." She turned back to face him, no longer trying to hide the tears on her cheeks. Frank looked at her with such understanding and kindness that it made her chest ache in an entirely different way. He took a clean handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her without comment, waiting patiently while she wiped her eyes and composed herself. "You were hanging curtains in a shack," Frank said quietly, his storm-colored eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I would much rather you hang them in a real home instead. This house needs someone who will care for it the way it deserves, someone who understands that a home is more than just walls and a roof. I think you are that person, Miss Kane." Delilah clutched his handkerchief in her hands, feeling the quality of the fabric, the care with which it had been pressed and folded. Everything about Frank Keller spoke of a man who paid attention to details, who valued quality and craftsmanship. A man, she was beginning to realize, who might value the same things she did. "I accept your offer, Mr. Keller," she said, her voice steady now, "with the understanding that this is a professional arrangement, and that I expect to be treated with the respect befitting an employee of this household." "You have my word on that," Frank said solemnly, then extended his hand to shake on the agreement. Delilah took it, feeling the warmth and strength of his grip, the calluses that marked him as a man who worked alongside his employees rather than simply directing from a distance. The handshake lasted perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary, and when they broke apart, she felt the loss of that contact more keenly than she wanted to admit. "When would you like me to start?" Delilah asked, forcing herself back to practical matters. "Yesterday," Frank said with a slight smile. "But I understand you will need to collect your belongings from the shack and settle in here. If you would like, I can have Charlie and another man ride out tomorrow morning to help you transport everything. You can spend tonight here, get comfortable with the house, and officially begin your duties the day after tomorrow. That will give me time to introduce you to the rest of the men and establish the household routine." "That seems more than fair," Delilah agreed. "Though I should warn you, I do not have many belongings to transport. What you saw in the shack is essentially everything I own in the world." "Then we will make sure to bring all of it," Frank said simply. "Why don't you take some time to settle into your room while I arrange for dinner?" "Miguel has been doing his best with the cooking, but I warn you, his talents lie more with horses than food preparation." After Frank left, Delilah stood in the center of the room that would be hers, slowly turning to take in every detail. She walked to the windows and looked out at the prairie, seeing it now not as an empty, threatening expanse, but as the land surrounding her new home. She opened the wardrobe and found it empty and clean, ready for the few dresses and personal items she would bring from the shack. She sat on the bed and discovered the mattress was thick and comfortable, stuffed with real feathers rather than corn husks or straw. For the first time since her father's death, Delilah allowed herself to feel something other than grief and fear. Hope, fragile and tentative, began to bloom in her chest. She had a job, a safe place to live, and an employer who seemed genuinely decent and honorable. It was more than she had dared to wish for when she woke up that morning in the drafty shack. A knock on the door frame made her look up. Frank stood there, respectfully remaining in the hallway. "Dinner will be ready in about an hour. I thought you might like some time to freshen up first. There is water in the pitcher and clean towels in the washstand drawer. Please make yourself comfortable and come down whenever you are ready." "Thank you, Mr. Keller," Delilah said, "for everything. You did not have to offer me this opportunity, and I want you to know I appreciate it more than I can properly express." "Frank," he corrected gently. "If we are going to be living under the same roof, even in a professional capacity, I think we can dispense with excessive formality. And I should thank you, Miss Kane. You are solving a problem for me as much as I am for you." "Then you should call me Delilah," she replied, surprised by her own boldness. "Miss Kane makes me feel like a schoolteacher or a spinster aunt." Frank smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his somewhat stern features into something warmer and more approachable. "Delilah it is, then. I will see you at dinner." After he left, Delilah poured water into the basin and washed her face and hands, marveling at the simple luxury of clean water and soft towels. She unpinned her hair and brushed it out as best she could without her few grooming tools, then repinned it in a neat bun at the nape of her neck. Her dress was worn and travel-stained, but it was clean at least, and she did her best to smooth out the worst wrinkles. When she made her way downstairs nearly an hour later, following the sounds and smells coming from the kitchen, she found Frank and two other men setting the table with a coordination that spoke of long practice. One was younger, probably close to her own age of 22, with dark hair and eyes and skin that suggested Spanish heritage. The other was older, lean and weathered, with the careful movements of someone nursing an old injury. "Delilah, meet Miguel Santos and Tom Patterson," Frank said, gesturing to each man in turn. "Miguel, Tom, this is Miss Delilah Kane, our new housekeeper. She will be whipping us all into shape starting day after tomorrow." Miguel flashed a brilliant smile and executed a small bow. "Miss Kane, you are an angel sent from heaven. I have been cooking for 3 weeks, and I think I have given the boss indigestion every single day." "I wouldn't say every day," Frank protested mildly. "That stew last Thursday was almost edible." Tom laughed, a rusty sound that suggested he did not do it often. "Don't let them fool you, Miss Kane. Miguel's cooking ain't that bad. It just ain't that good either. We're almighty glad to have someone who knows their way around a kitchen taking over." Dinner turned out to be a surprisingly pleasant affair. The food was indeed mediocre, an overcooked beef roast with potatoes that were simultaneously burned on the outside and raw in the middle, but the company more than made up for the culinary shortcomings. The men clearly had an easy camaraderie built over years of working together, and they made an effort to include Delilah in their conversation without making her feel like an outsider or a curiosity. She learned that Miguel had been born on the ranch, his parents having worked for Frank's father before him. Tom had come west after the war, one of thousands of displaced men looking for a fresh start and honest work. Charlie, the foreman she had met earlier, usually ate with the hands in the bunkhouse, supervising the younger men and keeping order among the crew. "How many men work here?" Delilah asked, trying to gauge the scale of her new responsibilities. 12 year-round, including Charlie, Miguel, Tom, and myself," Frank replied. "During roundup and branding season, we hire on another 8 to 10 temporary hands, but those men generally eat at the chuck wagon out on the range, so you would not be responsible for feeding them." "Still, cooking for 12 men is no small task," Delilah observed. "I will need to get a sense of supplies and dietary preferences. Are there any foods I should avoid preparing or any particular favorites I should know about?" The men exchanged glances, and Miguel spoke up first. "The boss here is not fond of okra, says it reminds him of eating something that already died once." "I would murder someone for a good apple pie," Tom said wistfully. "Haven't had decent pie since my mother died 10 years ago." "And Charlie will eat literally anything as long as there is coffee with it," Frank added with a smile. "The man runs on coffee the way most people run on air and water." Delilah found herself laughing, the sound feeling foreign after months of grief and isolation. "I think I can manage to avoid okra and make regular apple pies, and I can guarantee the coffee will always be hot and plentiful." After dinner, the men insisted on cleaning up, sending Delilah back upstairs to rest from her journey and prepare for the next day. She settled into her new room, still hardly believing her change in circumstances, and watched the sun set over the prairie through those beautiful cream-colored curtains. Somewhere out there, 5 miles distant, stood the shack with her pitiful blue curtains still hanging askew on the window. Tomorrow, Charlie and another man would help her collect those few belongings, and she would close that chapter of her life forever. That night, lying in the comfortable bed with clean sheets and warm quilts, Delilah allowed herself to think about Frank Keller in a way she had not permitted earlier. He was undeniably handsome, with those storm-colored eyes and strong features, but it was more than his physical appearance that drew her attention. There was a kindness in him, a decency that shone through in every interaction. The way he treated his men with respect, the way he had offered her employment without a hint of impropriety, the way he had given her his handkerchief when she cried without making her feel weak or foolish for her tears. She reminded herself sternly that he was her employer, that any romantic notions were both inappropriate and potentially disastrous. She needed this job, needed the stability and security it offered. She could not risk it all by developing feelings for a man so far above her station, a successful rancher who could have his pick of suitable women from Hays City, or even further afield. But as she drifted off to sleep, Her last conscious thought was of Frank's hand holding hers as they shook on their agreement, and the way his touch had made her feel safe for the first time in longer than she could remember. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and Delilah woke to the sound of men moving about below and the smell of coffee drifting up the stairs. She dressed quickly in her same worn dress, making a mental note that she would need to sew herself at least 1 or 2 new outfits now that she would have steady wages coming in. When she descended to the kitchen, she found Frank already there, pouring coffee into several tin mugs. "Good morning," he greeted her, his smile warm and genuine. "I hope you slept well. Charlie and Miguel are saddling horses to ride out to the shack. I thought I would accompany them as well to help with the heavier items." "That is very kind, but surely you have more important things to do than help move my few possessions," Delilah protested, though part of her was pleased by his consideration. "Nothing so important it cannot wait a few hours," Frank assured her. "Besides, I want to see this shack you were so determined to make into a home. I am curious about those blue curtains." They rode out together, Delilah once again seated behind Frank on his horse while Charlie and Miguel followed on their own mounts. The morning was cool and pleasant, a welcome respite from the brutal afternoon heat that would come later. During the ride, Delilah found herself relaxing against Frank's back, her hands resting more naturally on his waist than they had the previous day. She told herself it was simply because she was more accustomed to riding now, but deep down, she knew it was because she felt safer and more comfortable with him than she had any right to feel after such a short acquaintance. When they reached the shack, Delilah felt a pang of embarrassment at seeing it through the eyes of these men who lived in such comfort at the ranch. In the morning light, it looked even more decrepit than she remembered. Walls that leaned slightly, a roof with visible gaps, a door that hung crooked on its hinges. The blue curtains she had hung with such hope the previous day now seemed almost pathetic, a futile gesture toward domesticity in a place that could never be a real home. "You lived here alone?" Miguel asked incredulously, as he dismounted and surveyed the structure with frank disbelief. "Miss Kane, you are braver than any 10 men I know. I would not spend one night in this place without a small army to keep me company." "It was not ideal," Delilah admitted, sliding down from Frank's horse and approaching the shack with reluctance. "But it was all I could afford, and I needed somewhere to stay." Frank dismounted and walked around the perimeter of the shack, examining it with the eye of someone who understood construction and structural integrity. When he returned to where Delilah stood, his expression was troubled. "This place is not just uncomfortable, it is actually dangerous. Those support beams are rotted through in places, and that roof could collapse in a strong wind. You are fortunate nothing happened while you were living here." "I did not have many other options," Delilah said quietly, feeling defensive despite knowing he was right. "I know," Frank said gently, his hand briefly touching her shoulder in a gesture of comfort and understanding. "I am not criticizing your choices, Delilah. I am grateful you are somewhere safe now. Let's gather your things and get you permanently settled at the ranch." Her belongings fit easily into the saddlebags and bedrolls the men had brought. 2 other dresses, some undergarments, her mother's shawl, her father's rifle and the few tools he had managed to keep, a worn Bible that had belonged to her grandmother, and a small wooden box containing her mother's few pieces of jewelry and some old family photographs. The blue curtains she carefully folded and tucked into one of the saddlebags, unable to quite let go of them despite their poor quality. "Is this everything?" Charlie asked, looking around the bare interior with concern. "No other personal items, no cookware or supplies?" "I sold most of what we had to pay for my father's burial and medicine," Delilah explained. "These few things are all that remain of my family's possessions." The men exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them that Delilah could not quite interpret. Frank placed the last of her belongings carefully in his saddlebag, then turned to survey the shack one final time. "I am going to have some of the men come out here next week and tear this structure down before someone else tries to live in it and gets hurt. The lumber can be salvaged for repairs around the ranch." As they prepared to leave, Delilah took one last look at the place that had sheltered her during some of the darkest days of her life. It had been miserable and lonely and frightening, but it had also been hers, the first place she had tried to claim as her own after losing everything. She thought about hanging those blue curtains, about the hope she had felt despite the hopelessness of her situation, and she silently thanked the shack for keeping her safe until something better came along. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Frank helped Delilah carry her belongings up to her room while Charlie and Miguel saw to the horses. She unpacked her few possessions, hanging her dresses in the wardrobe, placing her father's tools carefully in the bottom, and setting her mother's jewelry box on the washstand where she could see it every day. The blue curtains she hesitated over, then finally hung them in the back of the wardrobe, unable to discard them but not quite ready to display them either. Frank appeared in the doorway as she was placing the family Bible on the small table beside the bed. "Is there anything else you need to feel properly settled?" he asked. "If there are supplies or personal items you require, we can arrange a trip into Hays City within the next few days." "I will need fabric to sew a few new dresses," Delilah admitted. "These 3 are all I have, and they are all quite worn. I can sew well enough to make my own clothes if I have the materials. Make a list of everything you need, and I will take you into town myself on Saturday," Frank offered. "The ranch account at the general store will cover any supplies necessary for your position, including appropriate clothing." "I can pay for my own fabric from my wages," Delilah protested, not wanting to seem like she was taking advantage of his generosity. "Consider it a uniform allowance," Frank countered with a slight smile. "You are representing the Keller Ranch now, and I want you to have everything you need to do so comfortably. Besides, you have not received your first wages yet, and it seems unfair to expect you to wait weeks for new clothes when you clearly need them now." Put that way, Delilah could hardly refuse without seeming either proud to the point of foolishness or ungrateful for his consideration. "Thank you, Frank. I promise I will be frugal with my selections." "Be practical," he corrected. "Frugality for its own sake is false economy. Buy what you need to do your job well and feel comfortable in your position." Over the next few days, Delilah threw herself into learning the rhythms of the household and establishing her authority in the kitchen. She woke before dawn that first official day of work, determined to prove herself worthy of the faith Frank had placed in her. By the time the men began filtering into the kitchen for breakfast, she had coffee ready, biscuits baking in the oven, and bacon sizzling on the stove. The look of pure relief on Frank's face when he walked into the kitchen and smelled real cooking made Delilah laugh out loud. "I told you I could manage coffee and breakfast," she said, pouring him a mug of the strong, dark brew. "Though I admit I am curious to see if my cooking lives up to the high standards set by Miguel's 3-week tenure." "A bowl of cold beans would live up to Miguel's standards," Tom said as he entered the kitchen and made straight for the coffee pot. "But this, Miss Kane, this smells like actual food prepared by someone who knows what they're doing." The breakfast was indeed a success, with the men consuming everything she had prepared with flattering enthusiasm and numerous compliments. After they had eaten and headed out to begin their day's work, Frank lingered in the kitchen while Delilah began cleaning up the dishes. "That was the best meal I have had in this house since my sister left 2 years ago," he said sincerely. "You have already more than earned your wages, and you have only been officially working for 3 hours." "It is just breakfast," Delilah demurred, pleased by his praise despite her attempt to seem modest. "Wait until I have had time to properly stock the pantry and plan real meals. Then you can judge whether I am worth my wages." "I have no doubts," Frank assured her. He picked up a dish towel and began drying the plates she had washed, ignoring her protests that he should not be doing kitchen work. "My mother taught me that running a household is work that deserves respect, and that helping with chores does not diminish a man's masculinity. Besides, this gives us a chance to discuss the household accounts and any supplies you need ordered." Working alongside Frank in the quiet kitchen felt surprisingly intimate and domestic, as if they were a long-married couple rather than an employer and his recently hired housekeeper. Delilah found herself hyper-aware of his presence beside her, the way his shoulder occasionally brushed hers as they worked, the deep timbre of his voice as he discussed the ranch's accounts and her budget for household expenses. She learned that Frank managed the ranch's finances carefully, but not miserly, prioritizing quality over cheap shortcuts. He gave her a generous monthly budget for food and household supplies, trusting her judgment on what was needed without requiring itemized approval for every purchase. It was a level of trust and responsibility she had not expected, and it made her more determined than ever to prove herself worthy of his confidence. Over the following weeks, Delilah transformed the ranch house from a functional but neglected space into a genuine home. She deep-cleaned every room, organized the pantry and kitchen with ruthless efficiency, and began planning meals that were both hearty enough for working men and refined enough to reflect well on the household. The men responded to her efforts with genuine appreciation, their initial politeness evolving into real warmth as they came to value not just her cooking but her presence in the household. Charlie, the foreman, proved to be an unexpected ally and friend. He often lingered in the kitchen after meals, sharing stories about the ranch's history and offering insights into the personalities and preferences of the various hands. From him, Delilah learned that Frank's father had been a hard but fair man who built the ranch through sheer determination and careful management. Frank had inherited not just the property, but his father's reputation for integrity and his commitment to treating employees well. The boss could have gone back east for college like his sister did, Charlie told her one evening as she prepared bread dough for the next day. "He's smart enough, and Lord knows the family had the money for it." But when his father's health started failing, Frank came home and learned everything he could about ranching. He was only 19 when the old man died, and there were plenty of folks who thought he was too young to run an operation this size. He proved them all wrong. "How long have you worked for the Kellers?" Delilah asked, kneading the dough with practiced movements. "Near about 25 years now," Charlie replied, a note of pride in his voice. "I came here as a young man with more ambition than sense, and Frank's father took a chance on me. When Frank inherited the ranch, he could have replaced me with someone of his own choosing, but he kept me on and promoted me to foreman. I would ride through fire for that man, Miss Kane, and I am not alone in that loyalty." The picture Charlie painted of Frank matched everything Delilah had observed herself. A man of principle and compassion, who led by example rather than intimidation, who valued people over profit without being foolish about the realities of running a business. The more she learned about him, the harder it became to maintain the professional distance she knew she should preserve. Saturday came, bringing with it the promised trip to Hayes City for supplies. Frank appeared at breakfast in clothes slightly more formal than his usual work attire, and Delilah wore her best dress, which was still embarrassingly worn and faded. She had created a careful list of needed supplies, keeping her fabric selections modest despite Frank's insistence that she buy whatever she needed. The ride into town took about an hour, and Frank had hitched up a wagon for the journey to accommodate the supplies they would be purchasing. Delilah sat beside him on the wagon seat, watching the prairie roll past and listening as he pointed out various landmarks and features of the surrounding territory. He clearly loved this land, understood its moods and seasons, and she found his enthusiasm infectious. Hayes City was larger than Delilah remembered from her brief time there after her father's death. The main street bustled with activity, cowboys coming in from surrounding ranches, farmers selling produce, women shopping for supplies, children playing in the dusty streets. Frank guided the wagon to a stop in front of the general store, then helped Delilah down with the same courtesy he always showed. Inside the store, Delilah was immediately overwhelmed by the selection of goods. There was so much here, far more than she had seen during her first desperate visit when she had been focused solely on finding the cheapest available food. Frank guided her to the fabric section, where bolts of cloth in various colors and qualities were displayed on shelves and tables. "Choose whatever you like," Frank encouraged as Delilah hesitantly examined a bolt of sturdy blue cotton. "You will need at least 3 or 4 dresses for regular wear, plus perhaps something nicer for church or social occasions." "I do not attend church," Delilah admitted quietly, aware of how that might sound to a respectable man like Frank. "Not because I lack faith, but because I have found that churches are often more interested in judging the poor than actually helping them." "Then you have been attending the wrong churches," Frank said firmly. "The minister in Hayes City is a good man who actually practices what he preaches about charity and compassion. But regardless, you will still need at least one nicer dress for when we have visitors to the ranch or need to attend social functions in town." The store proprietor, a portly man named Henderson who clearly knew Frank well, helped them select appropriate fabrics and notions. Delilah chose practical materials: sturdy cottons for work dresses, a nice calico for general wear, and a beautiful dove gray wool blend that would make a suitable dress for better occasions. Frank also insisted she select fabric for aprons, several spools of thread in coordinating colors, and new ribbons for her hair. "Your hair is beautiful," Frank said suddenly, seemingly surprising himself with the observation. "You should not hide it under such severe styles. These ribbons will look lovely when you want to dress it up a bit." Delilah felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected compliment, and she saw Henderson smile knowingly as he added the ribbons to their growing pile of purchases. Was it her imagination, or was Frank looking at her with more than just professional appreciation? The thought made her heart race in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. They continued through the store, selecting supplies for the household: flour, sugar, coffee, spices, canned goods, soap, lamp oil, and dozens of other items that would keep the ranch running smoothly. Frank consulted Delilah on quantities and brands, clearly valuing her input on household matters. When she hesitated over the price of real vanilla extract versus the cheaper imitation, he simply placed the genuine article in their basket without comment. As Henderson tallied their purchases and arranged for them to be loaded into the wagon, Frank excused himself briefly to visit the land office. Delilah waited in the store, watching the citizens of Hayes City go about their business and wondering if any of them could see how dramatically her circumstances had changed in just a few short weeks. A woman entered the store, elegantly dressed in a fashionable green gown that must have cost more than Delilah earned in 6 months. She was beautiful in a polished, perfect way, with golden hair arranged in elaborate curls and a parasol that matched her dress. The woman's eyes swept over Delilah dismissively before she approached Henderson with a list of her own requirements. "Is Frank Keller still in town?" the woman asked, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone accustomed to having her questions answered immediately. "Yes, Miss Winters. He just stepped out to the land office," Henderson replied respectfully. "I expect he will return shortly." The woman, Miss Winters apparently, settled in to wait, positioning herself near the window where she could watch for Frank's return. Delilah felt suddenly self-conscious in her faded dress and worn boots, acutely aware of the difference between herself and this polished society woman who clearly had some connection to Frank. When Frank returned a few minutes later, Miss Winters immediately swept forward with a brilliant smile. "Frank, what a lovely surprise. I had heard you were in town today. I wanted to remind you about the dance next Saturday evening at the town hall. You did promise to attend, remember?" "Hello, Catherine," Frank greeted her with polite friendliness but nothing more effusive. "Yes, I remember the dance. Let me introduce you to Miss Delilah Kane, my new housekeeper. Delilah, this is Catherine Winters. Her father owns the bank and several businesses here in Hayes City." Catherine's eyes swept over Delilah again, this time with more interest, but still with that underlying dismissiveness that stung. "How nice that you finally found someone to manage your household, Frank. I know it has been quite a challenge for you since Sarah left." "Delilah has been an absolute godsend," Frank said firmly, his hand coming to rest lightly on Delilah's shoulder in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. "She has transformed the house in just a few weeks and made it feel like a real home again. I consider myself extremely fortunate to have her managing my household." Something in Catherine's expression tightened at Frank's praise, though her smile never wavered. "How wonderful. Frank, will you save me a dance next Saturday? It has been far too long since we had a chance to properly catch up." "I am not much for dancing these days," Frank said, his tone pleasant but firm, "but I will try to attend for at least part of the evening." After extracting a few more vague promises from Frank, Catherine finally took her leave. Once she was gone, Frank turned to Delilah with an apologetic expression. "I should have warned you about Catherine. She has had rather determined marriage plans regarding me for the past few years, despite my complete lack of encouragement." "She is very beautiful," Delilah observed, trying to keep her voice neutral even as jealousy twisted in her stomach. "She is very wealthy and very ambitious," Frank corrected. "And she sees me as a suitable match for her social climbing rather than as an actual person. I have no interest in being someone's trophy husband, no matter how beautiful or wealthy the woman might be." They loaded the supplies into the wagon and began the journey back to the ranch. Delilah found herself thinking about Catherine Winters and the dance next Saturday, about the difference between a polished society woman and a housekeeper with only 3 worn dresses to her name. Frank must have noticed her preoccupation because he reached over and gently touched her hand where it rested on her lap. "What is troubling you?" he asked softly. "And please do not say nothing. I have learned to read your expressions well enough to know when something is bothering you." "It is nothing important," Delilah hedged, not wanting to reveal her confusing tangle of feelings. "I was just thinking about the differences between people, about where they come from and what opportunities they have in life." "Opportunities can be created as well as inherited," Frank said thoughtfully. My grandfather was a dirt-poor farmer who barely kept his family fed. My father took the opportunities available to him and built something substantial. I have had advantages my father and grandfather never did, but that does not make me better than them. It just means I have different responsibilities. Do you ever regret not marrying someone like Miss Winters? Delilah asked, then immediately wanted to take the question back. I am sorry, that was far too personal and none of my business. No, it is a fair question given the circumstances, Frank said easily. And the answer is no, I do not regret it at all. I watched my parents build a marriage based on genuine affection and respect, and I will not settle for less just to satisfy social expectations or business considerations. When I marry, it will be because I have found a woman I actually want to spend my life with, not because she has the right pedigree or bank account. The conversation shifted to more neutral topics, but Delilah could not stop thinking about what Frank had said. A marriage based on affection and respect, a woman he actually wanted to spend his life with. She found herself wondering what kind of woman Frank would choose, what qualities he valued most, and whether she could ever measure up to those standards. Back at the ranch, the men helped unload the supplies while Delilah organized everything in the kitchen and pantry. She spent the rest of the afternoon cutting out patterns for her new dresses, grateful for the good light and spacious work surface in her room. As she worked, she thought about the dance next Saturday and the image of Frank dancing with Catherine Winters. The thought made her chest ache in a way she was not quite ready to examine too closely. Dinner that evening was a festive affair, with Delilah having prepared a special roast to celebrate the successful supply trip. The men ate enthusiastically, praising her cooking with the genuine appreciation of people who knew what it was like to survive on poor food. After the meal, Charlie pulled out a harmonica and played a few tunes while Miguel sang along in Spanish. It was the kind of warm, communal evening that made a house feel like a home, and Delilah felt a deep contentment settle over her. Later, as she was finishing the dishes, Frank appeared with a dish towel as had become his habit. They worked together in comfortable silence for a while before he spoke. I have been thinking about what you said earlier, about opportunities and differences between people. I want you to know that I do not see you as somehow lesser because of your circumstances, Delilah. You are one of the most capable, resilient people I have ever met, and I value you for who you are, not where you came from. Thank you, Delilah said softly, her hand stilling in the soapy water. That means more to me than you might realize. I also wanted to ask if you would be comfortable attending the dance in Hayes City next Saturday, Frank continued, his tone careful. Not as my housekeeper, but as my guest. I know I told Catherine I am not much for dancing, and that is true, but I would enjoy having someone there whose company I actually appreciate. Delilah's heart began racing as she processed what Frank was asking. He wanted her to attend the dance with him, not as an employee but as a guest. It was a level of social recognition she had not expected, and it came with complications she was not sure she knew how to navigate. Frank, people will talk, she said quietly. They will see the rancher arriving with his housekeeper and draw conclusions, most of them unkind. I do not want to damage your reputation or give people like Catherine Winters ammunition to use against you. Let them talk, Frank said firmly. I am not ashamed to be seen in public with you, Delilah. Quite the opposite, in fact. But if you are uncomfortable with the idea, I will not press you. I just thought it might be nice for you to have an evening out, to meet some of the other women in the community under more pleasant circumstances. Delilah dried her hands on her apron, thinking hard. Part of her desperately wanted to go, to have an evening of music and dancing, to attend a social function as a guest rather than a servant. But another part of her was terrified of the scrutiny and judgment that would inevitably come, of being compared to women like Catherine and found wanting. "Can I think about it?" she asked finally. "I need to finish my new dress first anyway, and I want to make sure I would be properly dressed for such an occasion." "Of course," Frank agreed immediately. "Take all the time you need to decide, and Delilah, whichever you choose, I will respect your decision completely." Over the next week, Delilah threw herself into finishing her dove gray dress, determined that if she did decide to attend the dance, she would at least look presentable. The fabric Frank had selected was beautiful, with a subtle sheen that caught the light, and she took great care with every seam and detail. She fashioned it in a simple but elegant style, with a fitted bodice and a skirt that draped gracefully without excessive ornamentation. It was not as elaborate as what someone like Catherine Winters might wear, but it was well made and suited her figure. Charlie noticed her working on the dress one evening and gave her an approving nod. "That is going to look real pretty on you, Miss Kane. Are you planning to attend the dance in town?" "I am considering it," Delilah admitted. "Frank invited me, but I am worried about causing talk or making things difficult for him socially." "Let me tell you something about the boss," Charlie said, settling into a chair with his ever-present coffee. "He doesn't give two hoots about what the gossips in Hayes City think of him. He cares about being fair, treating people right, and living according to his own principles. If he invited you to that dance, it is because he wants you there, and anyone who has a problem with it can take it up with him directly." "But what about his prospects?" Delilah pressed. "What about women like Catherine Winters who might be suitable matches for him?" Charlie snorted derisively. "Catherine Winters is about as suitable for Frank as a peacock is for farm work. All flash and no substance, and far too concerned with her own importance. Frank needs someone real, someone who understands hard work and genuine values, someone like—" He paused meaningfully, looking at Delilah with knowing eyes. "Well, someone like you, Miss Kane." Delilah felt her cheeks warm under Charlie's direct gaze. "I am his housekeeper, Charlie, that is all." "For now, maybe," Charlie agreed. "But I have been watching the way he looks at you when he thinks nobody is paying attention. And I have been watching the way you look at him too. I am old enough to recognize something real when I see it developing, and I am telling you, there is something real between you two. Even if that were true, which I am not saying it is," Delilah said carefully, "there are significant obstacles. The difference in our positions, for one thing. I depend on him for my livelihood and my home. Any relationship beyond employer and employee would be fundamentally unequal. Love does not care much about equal positions or social standings," Charlie observed. "It cares about connection and compatibility, about finding someone who makes your life better just by being in it. You think about that, Miss Kane, while you are deciding whether to go to that dance." By Friday evening, Delilah had made her decision. She found Frank in his office, reviewing account books by lamplight, and knocked softly on the door frame. He looked up with a smile that made her heart skip a beat. "I would like to attend the dance tomorrow if the invitation is still open," she said, proud of how steady her voice remained. "My new dress is finished, and I think I am ready to face Hayes City society." Frank's smile widened into something that looked like genuine joy. "I am very glad to hear that. I promise you will have a wonderful time, and anyone who dares to be unkind will answer to me." The next day passed in a flurry of preparation and nervous anticipation. Delilah prepared a simple cold supper that the men could serve themselves, then retreated to her room to get ready. She bathed carefully, using some of the lavender soap she had purchased on the last trip to town, then dried her hair until it shone. Instead of her usual severe bun, she arranged it in a softer style, pinning it up loosely and allowing a few curls to frame her face. The ribbons Frank had insisted she buy wove through her hair, adding a touch of color and femininity. The dove gray dress fit perfectly, the bodice hugging her curves while the skirt flowed gracefully to the floor. She had only her mother's simple pearl earrings and a cameo brooch for jewelry, but they suited the dress well. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She looked elegant, almost beautiful, certainly nothing like the desperate woman who had been hanging curtains in a shack just weeks ago. When she descended the stairs, she found Frank waiting in the parlor, dressed in a dark suit that transformed him from a rancher into a gentleman. His eyes widened when he saw her, and for a long moment, he simply stared without speaking. "You look absolutely beautiful," he finally said, his voice slightly hoarse. "That dress is perfect, and your hair. Delilah, you are going to be the most stunning woman at the dance." "You clean up rather well yourself," Delilah managed, her cheeks warm from his praise. "I have never seen you in a suit before." "I save it for special occasions," Frank said, offering her his arm. "Shall we?" The ride to Hayes City passed quickly, with both of them making nervous small talk about inconsequential subjects. As they drew closer to town, Delilah could hear music drifting on the evening air, and her stomach tightened with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Frank seemed to sense her nervousness because he reached over and squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Just remember, you have every right to be there," he said firmly. "You are my guest, and you are wearing a dress that cost honest wages from honest work. Hold your head high, Delilah. You have nothing to be ashamed of." The town hall was lit up brilliantly, with lanterns hanging from every available surface and people milling about in their finest clothes. Frank helped Delilah down from the wagon and offered his arm again, which she took gratefully. As they entered the hall, she was aware of heads turning, of whispered conversations and speculative glances. Frank ignored it all, guiding her confidently into the room and finding them seats along one wall. The music was provided by a small group of musicians in the corner. A fiddle, a guitar, and a piano that had been hauled in specially for the occasion. Couples were already dancing, swirling around the floor in patterns that looked both complicated and graceful. Delilah had never learned to dance properly, and she felt a moment of panic at the thought of embarrassing herself and Frank in front of all these people. "I should warn you, I do not really know how to dance," she whispered to Frank as he led her onto the floor for a simple waltz. "My parents could not afford dancing lessons, and I never had occasion to learn." "Then follow my lead, and do not worry about making mistakes," Frank said, positioning them properly and beginning to move to the music. "Dancing is supposed to be fun, not a test of your worth as a person." To Delilah's surprise, dancing with Frank was indeed fun. He was a patient teacher, quietly guiding her through the steps and not commenting when she occasionally stepped on his feet. After a few minutes, she began to relax and actually enjoy the sensation of moving to the music, of being held in Frank's arms in a socially acceptable way. She found herself laughing at her own mistakes, and Frank laughed with her, his eyes warm with affection and encouragement. They had completed 2 dances when Catherine Winters appeared at Frank's elbow, her smile bright but her eyes calculating. "Frank, you promised me a dance, remember? I am sure Miss Kane would not mind sitting out for a bit." Frank looked at Delilah questioningly, and she nodded, not wanting to seem possessive or jealous even though that was exactly how she felt. She retreated to the seats along the wall and watched as Frank and Catherine took the floor. Catherine was an excellent dancer, graceful and confident, and she looked up at Frank with obvious adoration. They made a striking couple, and Delilah felt her earlier joy deflate like a punctured balloon. "You must be Miss Kane," a warm voice said beside her. Delilah turned to find a woman probably a few years older than herself, with kind eyes and a friendly smile. "I am Martha Henderson. My husband owns the general store where you and Frank purchased supplies last week." "It is nice to meet you properly," Delilah said, grateful for the friendly overture. "You have a wonderful store. It had everything we needed." "Frank mentioned you are an excellent seamstress," Martha continued, gesturing to Delilah's dress. "That is beautiful work. Did you make it yourself?" They fell into an easy conversation about sewing and household management, and Delilah found herself relaxing despite the continued scrutiny from other attendees. Martha introduced her to several other women, mostly wives of local merchants and ranchers, who were cautiously friendly. The conversation was pleasant, and Delilah began to think she might actually enjoy the evening after all, when Frank finally extracted himself from Catherine and returned to Delilah's side. She noticed he looked somewhat harried. "I apologize for that," he said quietly. "Catherine has a way of monopolizing a person's attention whether they want it or not. Have you been all right?" "Mrs. Henderson has been very kind," Delilah assured him. "I have actually been having a nice time meeting people." They danced several more times throughout the evening, with Frank occasionally surrendering her to other ranchers for a turn around the floor. Delilah was pleasantly surprised to find that most people treated her with courtesy and respect, though she caught the occasional disapproving glance or whispered comment. Frank remained attentive throughout, always returning to her side between dances and making it clear through his actions that she was his chosen companion for the evening. As the night wore on, and the music grew slower and more romantic, Frank pulled Delilah into his arms for a waltz. This time, they moved together with practiced ease, her earlier clumsiness forgotten as she relaxed into his lead. Frank's hand was warm on her waist, and she found herself wanting the dance to last forever, wanting to stay in this moment where the complications of their real life did not intrude. "Thank you for coming with me tonight," Frank said softly, his breath warm against her ear. "I know it was not an easy decision, and I appreciate your courage in facing down the gossips and the judgers." "Thank you for inviting me," Delilah replied, looking up into those storm-colored eyes and feeling her heart clench with emotions she was no longer trying to deny. "I have not had this much fun in longer than I can remember." Something in Frank's expression intensified, and for a moment, Delilah thought he might say something significant, something that would change the nature of their relationship forever. But then the song ended, and the moment passed, and they were just an employer and his housekeeper again, maintaining appropriate boundaries in front of the watchful eyes of Hayes City society. They left shortly after midnight, both pleasantly tired from the dancing and socializing. The ride home was quiet, with Delilah's head occasionally drooping onto Frank's shoulder as exhaustion claimed her. When they arrived at the ranch, Frank helped her down from the wagon with his usual courtesy, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary on her waist. "I had a wonderful time tonight," Delilah said, looking up at him in the moonlight. "It meant a lot to me that you would invite me to such an event and treat me with such respect in front of everyone." "You deserve respect, Delilah," Frank said seriously, "and not just from me but from everyone. I hope tonight helped you see that you have as much right to participate in community life as anyone else." They stood there for a long moment, neither quite wanting to break the spell of the evening. Finally, Frank stepped back with visible reluctance. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow is Sunday, so you can sleep in a bit if you like. The men can fend for themselves for breakfast." Delilah nodded and made her way inside, but she could feel Frank's eyes on her until she closed the door. In her room, she carefully removed the dove gray dress and hung it in the wardrobe, already thinking about the next time she might have occasion to wear it. She unpinned her hair and brushed it out, replaying the evening in her mind, and dwelling especially on those moments when Frank had held her close during the slow dances. She was falling in love with him. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, leaving her breathless and slightly dizzy. Despite all her resolutions about maintaining professional boundaries, despite the fundamental inequality in their positions, despite every logical reason why she should guard her heart carefully, she was falling hopelessly, helplessly in love with Frank Keller. The question now was what, if anything, she should do about it. The next few weeks passed in a pleasant rhythm of work and routine, but with an underlying tension that had not existed before. Delilah found herself hyper-aware of Frank's presence, noticing details she had overlooked before. The way he smiled when he came into the kitchen and smelled fresh coffee, the gentle way he treated the horses and other animals on the ranch, the respect with which he spoke to every employee regardless of their position. Everything about him seemed designed to make her fall deeper in love, and she was powerless to resist. Frank, for his part, seemed to find more and more excuses to spend time in the kitchen or wherever Delilah was working. He still helped with dishes most evenings, but now he also began appearing in the afternoon when she was planning menus or organizing supplies, offering his input on purchases, or sharing stories about the ranch's history. Their conversations ranged widely, from childhood memories to philosophical discussions about justice and society, and Delilah found herself cherishing these quiet moments of connection. Charlie noticed the growing attachment between them with the knowing eye of someone who had seen it all before. He began making himself scarce during Frank and Delilah's evening dish sessions, and he ran interference when other ranch hands seemed inclined to interrupt. Miguel and Tom also seemed to sense the shift in dynamics, treating Delilah with a growing respect that went beyond her role as housekeeper, and acknowledged her emerging position as someone important to their boss. One warm afternoon in late September, Delilah was in the garden behind the house, harvesting the last of the summer vegetables before the first frost arrived. She had discovered the neglected garden shortly after moving to the ranch and had spent several weeks bringing it back to productivity. Now, it yielded a steady supply of fresh produce that supplemented their supplies and added variety to the meals she prepared. Frank found her there, kneeling in the dirt with her skirts tucked up practically, and her bonnet protecting her face from the sun. He watched her for a moment before announcing his presence, struck by how naturally she had integrated herself into every aspect of ranch life. She had transformed not just the house, but the entire feel of the property, bringing warmth and life to spaces that had felt empty and sterile during his years of bachelorhood. "The garden looks wonderful," Frank said, announcing his presence. "I had almost forgotten we had one until you started working on it." Delilah looked up with a smile, pushing a stray lock of hair back from her face and leaving a smudge of dirt on her cheek. It was criminal to let such good soil go to waste. With proper care, this garden could produce enough vegetables to supply the ranch year-round with plenty left over to preserve for winter. Frank sat down on the edge of the raised bed, not caring that he was getting dirt on his work pants. "You have a real gift for seeing potential where others see only neglect. First the house, then the kitchen organization, now the garden. You have made this place feel like a real home again." "That is because it is a real home," Delilah said, returning her attention to the tomato plants she was harvesting. "Not like that shack where I was trying to hang curtains when you found me. This is what I always dreamed a home could be, solid and safe and full of life." The mention of the shack and the curtains brought Frank's mind back to that first day, when he had ridden out to meet his new neighbor and found a fierce young woman determined to make something beautiful out of nothing. He remembered how she had looked, balanced precariously on that chair, hanging threadbare curtains on a grimy window, and how his heart had ached at her obvious poverty and isolation. The impulse to help her had been immediate and overwhelming, but what he felt for her now went far beyond simple compassion or employer satisfaction. "Delilah," he said carefully, knowing he was about to step over a line that could never be uncrossed. "I need to tell you something, and I hope it will not make you uncomfortable or compromise your position here." She looked up at him, her dark eyes suddenly wary. "What is it?" "I have feelings for you," Frank said bluntly, deciding that honesty was the only approach that honored what they were building together. Feelings that go well beyond what an employer should feel for his employee. "I have tried to suppress them, tried to maintain appropriate boundaries, but I cannot do it anymore. I think about you constantly. I find excuses to be near you. I lie awake at night thinking about your smile and your laugh and the way you make everything around you better just by being present." Delilah had gone very still, her hands frozen on the tomato she had been picking. "Frank, you know this is complicated. I work for you. I live in your house. There is a fundamental power imbalance that makes any relationship beyond employment problematic at best." "I know," Frank agreed. "And if you want me to never mention this again, to pretend I never said anything and maintain our current arrangement, I will respect that completely. But I also know that pretending is becoming impossible for me, and I hope, that maybe you feel something similar." "Am I wrong about that, Delilah? Am I imagining the connection between us?" For a long moment, Delilah said nothing. Then she carefully placed the tomato in her basket and sat back on her heels, looking at him with an expression that was part fear, part hope, and part something that looked like relief. "You are not imagining it," she said quietly. "I have been trying so hard not to fall in love with you, Frank, but it has been like trying to stop the sun from rising. Every day, every kind word, every moment we spend together makes it worse. I am terrified of what this means, of what could happen if we pursue this and it goes wrong. I could lose everything, my job, my home, my reputation, but I am even more terrified of never taking the chance, of always wondering what might have been." Frank felt his heart soar at her words. He stood and offered her his hand, pulling her to her feet and then, very deliberately, cupping her face in his hands. The touch was intimate and tender, his thumbs gently wiping away the smudge of dirt on her cheek. "I cannot promise that everything will be perfect," he said seriously. "But I can promise that I will never use my position to pressure or manipulate you, that I will always treat you with the respect and honor you deserve, and that if you give me your heart, I will cherish it as the precious gift it is. I love you, Delilah Kane. I think I have loved you since the day I found you hanging those blue curtains, trying to make a home out of nothing." "I love you too," Delilah whispered, her eyes bright with tears. "I did not want to. I tried not to, but I love you so much it hurts." Frank bent his head slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, but Delilah rose on her toes to meet him halfway. Their first kiss was gentle and tentative, a question and an answer all at once. Then Frank pulled her closer, and the kiss deepened into something more passionate, weeks of denied longing pouring out in that single moment of connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Delilah laughed shakily. "Well, that certainly changes things." "It does," Frank agreed, resting his forehead against hers. "We will need to figure out how to navigate this carefully. I do not want people to think I took advantage of you or that your position was ever contingent on anything other than your excellent work. Your reputation matters, Delilah, and I will protect it as fiercely as I protect everything else I value." "What are you proposing?" Delilah asked, practical even in the midst of emotional upheaval. "Courtship," Frank said firmly. "Proper, public courtship where I treat you as the woman I intend to marry, not as my employee. We will need to be somewhat circumspect initially, but I want everyone to know that my intentions toward you are completely honorable. And when enough time has passed that no one can accuse you of impropriety, I want to marry you, Delilah. I want you to be my wife, my partner in building this ranch into something even more than it is now. You want to marry me." Delilah repeated, as if she could not quite believe what she was hearing. "Frank, you could marry someone like Catherine Winters, someone with money and connections and social standing. Why would you choose someone like me?" "Because Catherine Winters would never kneel in a garden getting dirt on her skirts to harvest vegetables," Frank said simply. "Because she would never see potential in a rundown shack or hang curtains with hope in her heart despite impossible circumstances. Because she would never make this house feel like a home the way you have. I do not want someone with money and connections, Delilah. I want someone real, someone who understands hard work and genuine values. I want you." Delilah kissed him again, pouring all her love and gratitude and hope into the gesture. When they broke apart this time, she was smiling through her tears. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to courtship, yes to partnership, yes to whatever future we can build together. I want all of it, Frank. I want you." They spent the rest of the afternoon in the garden, talking about practicalities and dreams, making plans for a future that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. They decided to be open about their courtship with the ranch hands, trusting that Charlie, Miguel, Tom, and the others would support them and help maintain Delilah's reputation. They would continue their current living arrangements for the sake of propriety, with Delilah maintaining her position as housekeeper, while Frank courted her properly with public outings and social visits. That evening at dinner, Frank made a simple announcement to the assembled men. "I wanted you all to know that I am courting Miss Kane with the intention of eventually asking for her hand in marriage. I trust this household to treat her with the respect and support she deserves during this time." The men erupted in cheers and congratulations, clearly delighted by the news. Charlie raised his coffee mug in a toast. "About time you both admitted what was obvious to everyone else for weeks now. Miss Kane, welcome to the family, even if it is not quite official yet." Miguel produced a bottle of wine he had been saving for a special occasion, and they all toasted the new couple's happiness. The evening took on a celebratory atmosphere, with music and laughter filling the house in a way it never had before. Delilah felt herself glowing under the genuine warmth and acceptance from these men who had become like family to her. Later, as she and Frank did the dishes together one last time as just friends becoming more, he took her hand and held it gently. "I meant what I said in the garden. I love you, Delilah, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice in trusting me with your heart." "I know," Delilah said, squeezing his hand in return. "And I intend to spend the rest of my life being worthy of that love and building something beautiful together." Over the following months, Frank courted Delilah with a patience and thoughtfulness that made her fall even more deeply in love with him. He took her to church services in Hays City, where they sat together in the family pew and endured the curious stares and whispered speculation with heads held high. He brought her small gifts, ribbons for her hair, a new cookbook she had admired in the general store, wildflowers picked from the prairie during his morning rides. They spent long evenings talking about everything and nothing, learning each other's histories and dreams and fears. Delilah told him about her mother's death and her father's subsequent decline, about the fear and loneliness of being truly alone in the world for the first time. Frank shared his own griefs: his mother's death when he was still young, his father's gradual decline, and the weight of responsibility that had fallen on his shoulders at 19. The loneliness of running a successful ranch while watching friends and neighbors marry and start families. They discovered shared values and complementary strengths. Delilah's attention to detail and organizational skills balanced Frank's big-picture thinking and strategic planning. His calm steadiness provided an anchor for her occasional impulsiveness. Together, they began making plans not just for their future marriage, but for the ranch's continued growth and prosperity. Christmas arrived, bringing with it the first real snow of the winter. The ranch hands decorated the house with pine boughs and holly, transforming the solid structure into something magical and festive. On Christmas Eve, after a feast that had taken Delilah days to prepare, Frank pulled her into the parlor where a fire crackled merrily in the massive stone fireplace. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small velvet box. "I know we agreed to wait until spring to make anything official, but I could not let Christmas pass without giving you this." Delilah opened the box with trembling hands and gasped at what lay inside. A beautiful ring featuring a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, all set in delicate gold. It was not the largest or flashiest ring she had ever seen, but it was perfect in its simple elegance. "It was my grandmother's," Frank explained, taking the ring from the box and sliding it onto Delilah's finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "She gave it to my mother, who wore it every day until she died. My father saved it for me, hoping I would eventually find someone worthy of wearing it. I can think of no one more worthy than you, Delilah." "It is beautiful," Delilah breathed, holding her hand up so the firelight caught the stones and made them sparkle. "Are you asking me to marry you, Frank Keller?" "I am," Frank confirmed, pulling her close. "I know we agreed to wait, but I could not spend another day without you wearing my ring and everyone knowing that you have agreed to be my wife. Marry me, Delilah, not in some distant future, but soon. This spring, when the prairie is green and the wildflowers bloom. Marry me and be my partner in every sense of the word." "Yes," Delilah said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. I will marry you this spring or tomorrow or whenever you want. I just want to be with you, Frank, to build a life and a home and a future together." They announced their official engagement on Christmas Day, and the ranch hands celebrated with enthusiasm that bordered on raucous. Charlie hugged Delilah fiercely and whispered that her father would have been proud of the woman she had become and the man she had chosen. Miguel sang Spanish love songs at top volume, and Tom presented them with a beautifully carved wooden box he had spent months crafting in secret. News of the engagement spread through Ellis County quickly, meeting with mixed reactions. Most people were genuinely happy for the couple, having witnessed their courtship and recognizing it as a love match rather than a convenience. Some, like Catherine Winters, were less pleased, though Catherine maintained a facade of gracious acceptance even as her eyes betrayed her disappointment and jealousy. Delilah continued her work as housekeeper, though everyone now understood it was a temporary arrangement until the wedding. She threw herself into preparations for both the ceremony and her new role as mistress of the ranch. She sewed a wedding dress from beautiful white silk that Frank insisted on buying despite her protests about the expense. She worked with Martha Henderson and other women from Hays City to plan a reception that would be simple but elegant, reflecting their values and preferences. Frank, meanwhile, made preparations of his own. He expanded the master bedroom on the second floor, adding a sitting area where Delilah could have space for her sewing and personal pursuits. He consulted her on every decision, making it clear that this would be their home, not just his house where she happened to live. He also met with his lawyer to draw up papers that would protect Delilah's interests and ensure she would be provided for no matter what happened, wanting her to know she was choosing marriage freely and not out of financial necessity. Winter slowly gave way to spring, and the Kansas prairie transformed from brown dormancy to vibrant green life. Wildflowers began blooming in profusion: purple coneflowers, yellow black-eyed Susans, white and purple prairie clovers. The cattle grew fat on the new grass, and the horses frolicked in the pastures like youngsters. Everything seemed to be coming alive again, mirroring the new life Delilah and Frank were preparing to begin together. The wedding took place on a perfect April morning, with the prairie in full bloom and the sky an endless blue overhead. They held the ceremony outdoors at the ranch, with the minister from Hays City officiating, and what seemed like half the county in attendance. Delilah walked down an aisle marked by wildflowers, escorted by Charlie, who had offered to stand in for her late father. She wore her white silk dress and her mother's pearl earrings, and she carried a bouquet of prairie flowers that Frank had picked himself that morning. Frank waited for her at the makeshift altar, looking handsome in a new suit and more nervous than she had ever seen him. When their eyes met, though, his anxiety seemed to melt away, replaced by a joy so profound it took her breath away. They spoke their vows in clear, steady voices, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever joys and sorrows life might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Frank kissed her with a tenderness that made several women in the audience sigh romantically. The reception that followed was a joyous affair, with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the night. Delilah danced with Frank, with Charlie, with Miguel and Tom, and with half the men who had ridden in from neighboring ranches to celebrate with them. As the sun set and the party began winding down, Frank took Delilah's hand and led her away from the crowd, back toward the house that was now truly their home together. They climbed the stairs to the expanded master bedroom, which had been decorated with flowers and candles by the thoughtful hands of their friends. "I love you, Mrs. Keller," Frank said, pulling her into his arms and kissing her deeply. "I never thought I would find someone who would make me this happy, who would make my life feel this complete." "I love you too," Delilah replied, resting her head against his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Do you remember that day you found me in the shack, hanging those awful blue curtains? How could I forget?" Frank said with a soft laugh. "You were so fierce and proud, determined to make a home out of nothing. I knew immediately you were special." "I was hanging curtains in a shack," Delilah said quietly, "trying to convince myself I could survive there. And you told me I should hang them in a real home instead. You gave me that, Frank. You gave me a real home, a real life, real love. Everything I have now is because you saw something worth saving in a desperate woman with nothing to her name." "No," Frank corrected gently, tipping her chin up so she had to look at him. "Everything you have now is because you had the courage to take a chance, to trust in possibilities rather than giving up when life got hard. I just provided the opportunity, Delilah. You did all the real work of building this life." They stood together at the window, looking out over the prairie that stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars. This was their land now, their home, their future spreading out before them with all the promise of the Kansas spring. They had both traveled difficult roads to reach this moment, but those struggles had prepared them for the partnership they were building, teaching them resilience and compassion, and the true value of love freely given and joyfully received. The first year of their marriage passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Delilah discovered she loved being the mistress of the ranch, not just managing the household but actively participating in the business decisions that kept the operation thriving. Frank valued her input on everything from cattle purchases to employee relations, and together they made decisions that strengthened the ranch's reputation and profitability. Delilah also took a more active role in the community, using her position as Frank's wife to advocate for others who were struggling as she once had. She established a small fund to help widows and orphans get established in the area, remembering how close she had come to complete destitution. She worked with the church to provide meals and support to families facing hardship, and she became known throughout Ellis County as someone who never forgot where she came from and always extended a helping hand to those in need. That first Christmas as a married couple, Delilah discovered she was pregnant. The news filled both her and Frank with joy and a healthy dose of terror, neither having expected to start their family quite so quickly. As Delilah's belly grew through the winter and into the spring, Frank became almost comically overprotective, insisting she rest more and work less, though Delilah largely ignored his fussing and continued her activities at her own pace. Their first child, a healthy baby boy, was born during a thunderstorm in late May. They named him Samuel, after Frank's father, and from the moment Delilah held him in her arms, she felt her heart expand with a love she had never imagined possible. Frank was equally besotted with his son, spending hours just watching him sleep or holding him while Delilah recovered from the birth. Charlie, Miguel, and Tom all took turns helping with the baby, becoming honorary uncles who spoiled young Samuel shamelessly. The ranch house, which had once been a quiet bachelor establishment, now rang with baby cries and laughter, with midnight feedings and early morning coos. It felt more like a home than ever before, filled with life and love and hope for the future. 2 years later, Delilah gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, after Frank's mother. Rose had her mother's dark hair and her father's storm-colored eyes, and she was fierce and determined from the moment she entered the world. Watching Frank with their daughter, seeing his gentleness and pride, made Delilah fall in love with him all over again. As their children grew, Delilah often thought back to that desperate day when she had stood in a drafty shack, hanging threadbare curtains and trying to convince herself she could build a life from nothing. The contrast between that moment and her current reality sometimes seemed too vast to be real, as if she had somehow stumbled into someone else's life by mistake. But it was real, all of it. The beautiful home filled with laughter and love, the successful ranch that provided security and purpose, the husband who cherished her and the children who called her mama, the community that had embraced her and the friends who valued her. She had hung curtains in a shack once, but Frank had been right to tell her she should hang them in a real home instead. And together, they had built not just a home but a life that exceeded her wildest dreams. Years passed in a happy rhythm of seasons and celebrations, challenges met and overcome together. Samuel grew into a thoughtful, responsible boy who loved working alongside his father on the ranch. Rose proved to be as fierce as her mother and as determined as her father, keeping everyone on their toes with her boundless energy and curiosity. 2 more children followed, another son named Thomas and a daughter named Lily, each adding their own personality and joy to the growing family. The ranch continued to prosper under Frank and Delilah's joint leadership. They made improvements and expansions, always with an eye toward sustainability and treating their employees fairly. The Keller Ranch became known not just for its success, but for its values, and young men from across Kansas sought employment there, knowing they would be treated well and have opportunities to learn and advance. Delilah never forgot her humble beginnings, and she made sure her children understood the value of hard work and compassion for those less fortunate. She told them stories about their grandmother who had loved their grandfather despite his struggles, and about their grandfather who had tried to build a better life, even when circumstances were against him. She told them about the shack where she had lived alone and afraid, and about the day their father had ridden up and changed everything. "Your father saw something worth saving in me when I was at my lowest point," she would tell them. "That is what real love does. It sees potential and possibility even in the darkest circumstances. It offers hope and opportunity without demanding anything in return. That is the kind of people I want you to be. People who lift others up rather than pushing them down. People who understand that where someone starts is less important than where they are trying to go." Frank would add his own lessons, teaching his children about integrity and responsibility, about the privilege of having resources and the obligation to use them wisely and generously. Together, they raised children who understood both their advantages and their duties, who worked hard and treated everyone with respect regardless of social standing. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Frank took Delilah back to the spot where the shack had once stood. He had torn it down as promised, but he had also done something else. He had built a small monument there, a simple stone marker with an inscription that read, "On this ground, hope survived against all odds. May we never forget that courage and determination can overcome any obstacle." Delilah stood before the monument with tears in her eyes, Frank's arm around her shoulders and their children clustered around them. "Why did you do this?" she asked softly. "Because it is important to remember where we came from," Frank said simply. "Because this place, as humble and difficult as it was, is part of our story. You were hanging curtains in a shack here, trying to make something beautiful out of nothing. That determination, that refusal to give up even when everything seemed hopeless, that is what made me fall in love with you. I wanted to mark this place, so our children and our children's children will remember that the Keller family was built on courage and love, not just on land and cattle." As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Delilah reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought her here. She had been utterly alone, nearly destitute, living in a shack and hanging pathetic curtains in a futile attempt to create a sense of home. Frank had ridden up that day with an offer that changed everything, but more than that, he had offered her respect and dignity when she had every reason to expect neither. Their love story was not a fairy tale where a prince rescued a damsel in distress. It was something better. A story about two people who found each other at the right moment, who chose to build something together based on mutual respect and genuine affection, who worked hard to create a life and a home and a family that reflected their values. It was a story about seeing potential where others saw only poverty, about offering opportunities rather than charity, about building something real and lasting from the ground up. Frank and Delilah lived long, happy lives together, their love deepening with each passing year. They faced challenges and sorrows along the way, as all lives do, but they faced them together, drawing strength from their partnership and their shared commitment to the family and community they had built. They grew old together on the ranch, watching their children marry and have children of their own, seeing the legacy they had created spreading out like ripples in a pond. On their golden wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren and friends who had become family, Frank raised a glass to toast his wife. 50 years ago, I found this woman hanging curtains in a shack, determined to make a home out of nothing. I told her she should hang them in a real home instead, and she trusted me enough to take that chance. Every day since has been a gift, and I thank God for sending me to that shack at exactly the right moment. I was the one who was fortunate, Delilah replied, her eyes still bright despite the years that had softened her features. You saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. You offered me opportunity when others only saw my poverty. You loved me when I had nothing to offer but myself. That is the greatest gift anyone ever gave me, and I have tried to spend every day since being worthy of that gift. They danced that night, moving slowly to music played by their grandchildren, their bodies fitting together with the ease of 5 decades of practice. And as they swayed in the center of the room they had built together, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had forged through love and hard work, they both knew they had gotten it exactly right. The curtains in the ranch house windows, the ones Delilah had sewn herself from quality fabric, hung straight and beautiful, framing views of the prairie that had become the landscape of their shared life. But sometimes, in a small frame on Delilah's dresser, she kept those original blue curtains from the shack, faded and threadbare, a reminder of where she had started and how far love had carried her. Frank noticed them there one day and picked up the frame, studying those poor curtains with a thoughtful expression. "Why do you keep these?" he asked gently. "Because they represent hope when I had almost given up," Delilah replied, taking the frame from him and looking at the curtains with fondness rather than shame. "I was hanging these in that shack, trying so hard to make something beautiful happen, and then you arrived and told me I should hang them in a real home instead. You gave me that real home, Frank, but more than that, you gave me the faith to believe I deserved one. These curtains remind me that sometimes our most desperate moments are just the darkness before dawn, that help can come from unexpected places, and that real love sees potential where others see only failure." Frank pulled her close, holding her with the same tenderness he had shown 50 years earlier when he helped her down from his horse for the first time. "You never needed anyone to give you worth, Delilah. You always had it. I just provided the opportunity for that worth to be recognized and appreciated. Everything you built, everything we created together, that came from your strength and determination, not from any gift I gave you." "Then let us agree that we saved each other," Delilah said, resting her head against his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart, a sound that had become as familiar as her own breathing over the decades. "I was hanging curtains in a shack, and you were living in a house that was not quite a home. Together, we created something neither of us could have built alone." "Together," Frank agreed, and in that single word was the summation of their entire life. Two people who had found each other when they needed it most, who had chosen to build something beautiful together, and who had never once regretted taking that leap of faith. When they eventually passed, first Frank at the age of 85, and then Delilah 2 years later, they were laid to rest together on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to honor them, sharing stories about their love and their legacy, about the values they had instilled and the example they had set. And in the ranch house that had been their home for more than 50 years, new curtains hung in the windows, sewn by granddaughters who had learned the skill from Delilah. But in the place of honor in the parlor, in a beautiful wooden case crafted by one of their great-grandsons, hung those original blue curtains from the shack, now recognized as precious relics of the family's history. A small plaque beneath the case told the story in simple words. She was hanging curtains in a shack. The rancher said, hang them in a real home instead, and together they built not just a home but a legacy of love that endures through generations. It was a story about courage in the face of despair, about seeing worth in unexpected places, about the transformative power of love freely given and gratefully received. It was a story about two people who took a chance on each other and built something beautiful from the foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. And it was a story that lived on long after Frank and Delilah were gone, inspiring each new generation of Kellers to approach life with the same courage, compassion, and commitment to building homes filled with love rather than just houses filled with possessions. The Kansas prairie continued its eternal cycle of seasons, winter giving way to spring, summer to fall, year after year, generation after generation. And on that hill where Frank and Delilah rested together, wildflowers bloomed each spring without fail. Purple coneflowers and yellow black-eyed Susans and white prairie clovers, painting the landscape with color and beauty. A living testament to the love story that had begun with a desperate woman hanging curtains in a shack, and a rancher wise enough to see the potential in both the woman and the moment.